Okay, welcome. We might get started. Thanks for coming along. It's last week of semester for those of us who are teaching or in subjects, so I know it's a really intense time for a lot of us, so it's really good to see a lot of people here, and thanks to the Zoom audience as well. I can't see you, but you've been very consistent this semester, so thank you for that. Traditionally, the last week of semester is the last TESS seminar for the semester, but stay tuned because Yoko is trying to line up a special seminar for next week. So just waiting for that to fall into place. So she'll send out the normal announcements if it is indeed going to go ahead. So I don't want to say too much more about that. Anyway, I don't want to take any more time from Daniel, so I'll introduce Dr. Daniel Montesinos, who is a senior plant biosecurity researcher in the Australian Tropical Herbarium. So Daniel, as you would know, has done research in Spain and Portugal and the US, and has, is our local expert on weeds, and is getting some really interesting model systems going here with student researchers. And he's going to talk to us today about one of his latest papers. And I know when he had this out, he in his tweet, he mentioned that he'd looked up the word fastly.
No, because that's a slide.
Okay, I better not say anymore because it's a slide, as it turns out. Just wanted to, I think it's probably one of the most memorable titles I've read in a while. So yeah, I'm sure the talk will be memorable too. Thank you, Daniel.
I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Okay.
Anyway, thanks for coming. So Tess asked me to suggest a theme, and I just have finished this review that has been recently published. And I'm going to give you a take-home message right now, which is that invasive plants tend to be adapted to disturbance and to fast life cycles, which means that they grow fast, reproduce fast, and just have very quick life cycles. That's, of course, not universal. It's just a trend. Mostly, many invasives are in this fast side of the plant economic spectrum that now we'll go to explain what it is. And now, I find how to pass the slide. I've been said a number of times by native speakers that faster was not a word in English. Does anyone share that opinion here? Does anyone have a strong opinion about whether faster is a word or not in English? I was hoping to get some revenge with this one. So you the Collins Dictionary and the Wikipedia Wiktionary that have them. In all justice, is not in all dictionaries, but because English has no official English dictionary, this is good enough. As a minor prize for you, I have to say that it's labeled as English non-standard terms in the Wiktionary. So one for you, one for me in there. But it is a word. I had this conversation with the journal editorial board, and they ended up accepting it. So, but going to the title, first slide, fast low, what is this thing? And when I was invited to contribute to this special issue in Journal of Ecology about common garden experiments and the fast slow economic spectrum plants and climate change, I accepted without really knowing what it meant, I have to say. That's a problem I have, not being able to say no. I hope you don't share the problem with me, but this turned out well. The fast slow plant economic spectrum is actually quite intuitive, but it's a concept that was built around the economic spectrum of the leaves of plants. And it was based on specific leaf areas and how there were physiological constraints and trade-offs that determined that plants that had fast life cycles had one kind of leaves, and plants with slow growth cycles had another kind of leaves. And then quite recently, in 2014, it was proposed that this idea, this perspective, this way to interpret physiological data or ecological data could be expanded to the entire plant and just classify plants as fast or slow, metaphorically. And it's really quite intuitive, and it's actually a very interesting perspective that gives a fascinating way to interpret many phenomena. However, currently its use is mostly limited to people with a strong physiological plant physiology background. And many other ecologists, including most invasive ecologists, like myself, don't know what it means. And the aim of this review was like, well, I think that the kind of data that we're producing when assessing invasibility of plants is the kind of data that will fit very well into this way of interpreting the data, interpreting in terms of this fast, slow economic spectrum. So that's what it means. And the aim of what I'm going to explain you now in more detail is that invasive plants are fast. When they move to the non-native range, they adapt rapidly to new conditions. And they adapt in a way that generally makes them even faster. They grow in faster, become even bigger, and are predicted to increase their distributions under climate change. And we'll go over that with a few interesting examples. And this is just a little review, but I think you'll find very interesting. One of the things that caught my attention is that this fast, slow economics is not just something made up. It really is dependent on the environmental conditions. So if you see this plot, for instance, is the abundance of nitrogen is correlated with the lifespan. I'm not sure if this is the plant or the tree, sorry, but plants that live long tend to experience lower levels of nitrogen. Fast plants actually grow in places with a lot of nitrogen, which matches perfectly what we find on the invasives, if I'm interpreting correctly this plot, which I might not. Growth rates very clearly, and survivals after 5 years. Plants that survive for longer, definitely perennials if it's 5 years, have slower growth rates. Whereas annuals, obviously, will die immediately and will have way higher growth rates. And this might be dependent on the specific leaf area that you have. And the specific leaf area is highly dependent on the nitrogen that you have available in the environment. So it turns out that nutrient-rich environments are somehow through cascading effects on trade-offs, ending up promoting prevalence of plants that are aligned on the fast side of the plant economics spectrum. And the way that physiologists have been able to link all this, I think is really, really enlightening, really, very interesting. So going over the full review, just clarifying what the plant economic spectrum is. First point with a few examples. The invasives, as I said, are overrepresented at the fast side of the plant economic spectrum. This is one example. This is just for UK plants. They're showing here how many regions a species has over the world. So the more regions, the more invasive it is, so to speak. It's a more successful invasive. In this case, it's a relative term, but generally speaking, if you've been able to establish populations in more non-native regions across the world, you will be, in most cases, a more successful invasive plant or animal. And of course, the ones that were more successful were the ones having higher growth rates, which means that they were, again, on the fast side of the plant economic spectrum. Now, this has been very rarely contextualized in the area of invasive ecology, but one of the few papers that actually did is this one, in which they were comparing physiological variables, comparing invasive and non-invasive species. We see, in this case, is leaf mass area and photosynthetic capacity. Plants with higher leaf mass area, which is correlated with slow-growing species, will tend to have slower photosynthetic capacity. Again, nitrogen concentration correlated with higher photosynthetic capacity, how these links again together. And for alien species, they will always be on the higher side, on the fastest side of this plant economic spectrum. So there is some evidence. There hasn't been a consistent review until now, and I haven't done a meta-analysis or anything. This meta-analysis is not focused on it's not explicitly using the terminology of the fast, slow economic spectrum, but how this works is if this value and the confidence interval is above this line, this means it's significant, and the farther it goes, the stronger the effect. And when you compare invasive to non-invasive, invasives have higher fitness, higher size, higher growth rates, higher shoot allocation, higher leaf area allocation, and higher physiology, meaning higher photosynthetic rates, photosynthetic capacity, etc. It's interesting to join these two concepts so we can actually understand that they really are fast. I don't know why that is not, okay. On the same meta-analysis, I think the take-home message here is that for tropical climates, the effect is much stronger than for others. And I must have cut something out, sorry, because I don't get here in the legend what is this variable exactly, but it's the only one that is significant. And I think it's the one that is comparing tropical, the effect of the previous slide on tropical versus temperate climates. In the tropics, these patterns are even more significant, of a higher magnitude than in temperate habitats. Again, more examples, nitrogen cycling. This again is not assessing the plant economics spectrum specifically or explicitly, but clearly this is related to it. Invasive plants result in increased nitrogen pools, increase above ground vegetation. I don't even remember what this is. Nitrogen mineralization and litter. And if we go to the next one, again, we can see that this is way higher, even if this is significant, but the magnitude of this is like 2 or almost 3-fold higher in the tropics. And particularly, I think for nitrogen cycling, this is very important. When an habitat is invaded, nitrogen cycling goes to the roof. And that only facilitates the entry of other species, which are also on the fast side on the plant economic spectrum, which are able to take advantage of that increased nitrogen and to thrive in that environment at the expense of the natives that might not be able to grow fast enough to benefit from this increased nitrogen availability. Similar thing happens for islands, in case you're curious. Then the second part of the title will be Reuteral means adapted to disturbance. A Reuteral habitat is an habitat that is disturbed frequently. This could be a farm, a roadside. It could be a landscape which is burned frequently. Any kind of disturbance entails the appearance of a plant and animal community that is adapted to these disturbances. And that's very common in areas where agriculture has been there for long. In this article, we see that they're distinguishing here in orange between naturalized plant species and non-naturalized. By naturalized, they mean that non-native species have established viable populations. They might not expand, or they might expand. They didn't distinguish. But for simplicity, let's say that orange is invasives and blue is natives. And you can see that in terms of life forms, herbs and long-lived herbs predominate in the invasives, whereas there are invasives that are shrubs and trees, but proportionally, there's a lower proportion of them. Again, of course, herbs, and even if they're long-lived, they tend to have faster life cycles. And they tend to be more resilient to disturbance. In this meta-analysis, they clearly tested if non-native species were benefiting from disturbance, and there's a clear effect. They considered several factors. The ones that were clearly significant is nutrient addition, which is a kind of disturbance, and it's very common in farming, but it's also occurring because of nitrogen deposition, because we're just using so many fertilizers in farming areas that there's actually more available nitrogen in the atmosphere, and that nitrogen is depositing in natural areas, which results in nitrification. That again is another factor that is favoring the invasion by fast cycle invasive plants. And clearly is one of the disturbance types that has a highest magnitude effect, together with grazing and any kind of anthropogenic disturbance is correlated with the appearance of invasive species. And of course, when invasive species get into an habitat, non-native diversity and abundance is significantly higher, whereas the native diversity and abundance is not significantly lower, but clearly the dynamics are favoring the non-natives in the long run. So disturbance has this, it's a two-edged sword, and it's bad on both sides. It's first creating habitats that are more prone to be invaded because they have ideal conditions for these fast life cycle species to be introduced. And at the same time, we do know that the propagules of the invasive species are being introduced with the same machines, cars, roads that are being opened in the forest and that are bringing these seeds to these freshly disturbed habitats with lots of nitrogen available where they can thrive. So they really go hand in hand, and it's not surprising that disturbance is really the main vector for invasive species to get into habitats. Many well-established habitats will be quite resistant to disturbance, to invasion, sorry, if there is no disturbance. Once we start having disturbances, that's the edge of the sword where invasive species are getting into the habitat, promoting more disturbance, expanding furthermore, etc. Another interesting finding during the lead review I did is that an overwhelming proportion of invasive plants over the world are native to Europe. And this might, of course, be influenced by historical factors and the colonial past, but it might have to be also had to do also with perhaps the abundance of disturbance in European habitats. This has been high population density and a long history in farming that might have not been as common in other parts of America or Australia, for instance. Not that they were no farming, but not as important probably. And you can see here just a number of different habitats. But essentially, the take-home message from this article to me was very important is that, gosh, European plants are everywhere. And they tend, maybe not so much in the tropics. We might be on the safe side in that part. But everywhere else in temperate habitats, they really are predominantly the origin of most biological invasions, of most plant biological invasions. This is a recent article, scientists warning about invasive species. You've seen other similar warning articles, which are promoted from the same group of scientists. You can see here for different groups how invasives are just going up, and it's not coincidental that this correlates with an increase in disturbance of natural habitats. We've seen in previous talks, text talks, I think you gave one in which you were showing us how disturbance and road expansion was increasing, probably following a very similar pattern to the one we're showing here. It's not surprising that all these plants and animals are just expanding in parallel with that disturbance. I'm not going to go in depth into this, but let's just say that, of course, there are levels of disturbance that may be even too much for some species, but generally speaking, modeling confirms that disturbance is a critical factor. And there is experimental proof that many species are actually not able to establish viable populations in the absence of repeated disturbance. But if you think about it, a grazing farm is actually a repeated disturbance habitat, and it's no surprise that many foreign grasses are just expanding and thriving in there. Now we go to the next phase, fast become faster. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you might have seen other talks by me, and I don't want to reuse my own slides too much. But invasive species are known to develop rapid adaptations very quickly. I like this figure because it's showing you the number of studies that is telling you the upper bound for years sufficient for at least some evolutionary adaptive change to be recorded. And for a high number of studies, it's less than 50 years. For some, the evidence comes only after 300 years, but you can see that like probably more than 50% of the studies included in this review need less than 100 years for adaptive evolutionary changes to occur. When plants are introduced into a new region with different environmental conditions, they actually shift the trade-offs. There are many explanations for this. One of them is that, excuse me, the most well-known one is that you escape from herbivores or other kind of pathogens that are only present in the native range. When you're introducing the non-native range, And not having those pathogens or herbivores release a lot of resources that you were previously allocating to chemical defenses, for instance, or spines, to, for instance, increase photosynthetic systems, increase growth, increase competitive ability, and that gives you an advantage in that non-native range because you don't have natural enemies there, or you only have generalist enemies, but not specialist enemies. And apologies for this plot, it's where it came in the paper. But just the take-home message is when they do actually, and this is an Australian study, when they did this for a number of species native to several places, I think the blue ones are the native range for several traits, and the yellow ones are the non-native ranges. The asterisks are indicating significant differences, and we're seeing, for instance, that herbivory is higher in the native than in the non-native ranges for these species. If we go to another figure, this is separating for different regions, but here leaf area is higher in the non-native than in the native. Again, rapid adaptive changes, and this is in common garden experiments in which they're controlling for environment. So what they're measuring here, it's allegedly mostly genetic based and adaptive, and not just the consequence of maternal effects. And there are so many examples. I'm not gonna go through a big array of them. I avoided using my own examples this time, but this meta-analysis just proves very clearly, clear increase in reproductive traits, and this is almost significant, below vegetative growth, etc. The overall effect clearly significant when you compare invasives versus natives. The invasives have shifted their traits. Oh no, excuse me. This is a comparison of the same species, individuals from the native range and individuals from the non-native range of the same species that have evolved towards having higher biomass and higher growth and faster reproductive cycles in the non-native range than their conspecifics from the native range. And this might have happened, and this is a meta-analysis, but as we saw, this might have happened in as little as 50 years and in as much as maybe 200 years since introduction. And now, wrapping up the talk, I think the message is clear that invasives are rapid, that they're becoming even more rapid when they're introduced into other habitats. But the interesting thing of invasives is that they're very good in study systems to understand that will happen to natives. And this is particularly relevant when we're thinking about climate change. Because if you think about it, when an invasive plant is introduced into a non-native region, they are experiencing a different climate. It might not be radically different. Maybe it will be a very similar climate, and it will be just the community that is interacting with it which is different. But in many, many cases, the climate is actually very different. And in fact, and this is, I think this is 2021, this paper just came out saying climatic night shifts are common in introduced plants. And you can see here, and I think this is kind of cartoonish, but this is, according to these two variables, precipitation and temperature, this is the environmental, these are the environmental conditions experienced by the species in their native range, and this will be the shifted environmental conditions that they're experiencing in their non-native range. And this, I don't remember exactly, but some of them are the realized niche and the potential niche and blah, blah, blah. And it can get quite complex, but very simply, their niche has shifted when they're introduced in the non-native range, and they've been able to adapt to it. And if you're curious about geography and how this goes, I find this interesting because Africa gets their column, North America and South America are divided by 2, but then Australasia and Eurasia, we're all sharing Asia here. I don't know very well how this works, but you can see that the red one is showing you the niche overlap between native and non-native, and you can see that actually the niche overlap in many cases is less than half. Like they're actually shifting niches very significantly in the non-native ranges. Then this other article tells us, look, we do know this of invasives because we've been studying invasives a lot, and we've been studying under which conditions they're able to thrive, and so we're understanding this very well. But it turns out that natives, of course, are adapting all the time too. It's just that we don't have as much evidence because it's very difficult to know how long it took to this plant to adapt locally, because we don't know the introduction date. Whereas with invasives, we usually have at least some general idea. It was introduced 100 years ago. If it's Australian and comes from Europe, it should be, roughly 200 and something years ago at most. But when we do studies with natives, we do find that natives actually are adapting all the time. This tells us that if invasives are being able to adapt to these very different climates, natives may be able to do too, or at least some of them. And this has important consequences for climate change, for predicting what's going to happen with our habitats, and maybe to make more informed decisions when managing habitat conservation and restoration in the face of climate change. The conceptual framework is simple. This is the native range of a species. This is unsuitable because of environmental change. Then suddenly there is newly suitable habitats, and some of it is colonized by the species. So with time, we're expecting that we were here, we have all native species, we start having alien species, and then we should expect to have neo-native species. These neo-native species will be native species that are shifting their ranges and maybe displacing other native species that may not be able to migrate as quickly as these do. And in animals, they will be a little more intuitive, but in plants, this can be dramatic. You can have a native species migrating to the mountain tops, for instance, in the project that Darren and others at the herbarium are developing. And it's not invasive species that are displacing plants from the mountain top and making them disappear. It's other natives. It's these neo-natives that they call here. And they even go as far as to name Archaea biota and Neobiota to distinguish between alien species that have been there for long and have actually developed local adaptations, and the ones that will massively increase their abundance when climate change makes everything more suitable for them. And there is an example here with deer, more animal friendly. I think this is the only slide with an animal in this presentation. But this is an example of North America of native animals migrating north because of climate change, but eventually displacing some of the species that might not be able to migrate farther north. And there are some traits here that they developed as a risk assessment on the same article. Of course, if you go to the high risk traits that can be identified on a species that could become harmful, they tend to be associated with the fast side of the plant economics spectrum, or in this case, it could be even with the animal economics spectrum. As far as I know, no one is using that term in animal ecology, but I think it could be an interesting concept to explore. So wrapping up, invasives align with the fast side of the plant economic spectrum, mostly. Of course, there are numerous and notable exceptions, including wood invasives are all across the board. Wood invasives that are faster are not particularly more invasive than the ones that are not. Invasive are adapted to rural disturbed habitats in their native range. The native range is very frequently Europe, at least out of the tropics, and they are able to rapidly adapt to new local conditions. And they adapt towards being even faster, which will still provide them with more benefits with climate change. Still, disturbance is, if I had to highlight one factor that will be the worst contributor to biological invasions, it will be disturbance. If there is a managing intervention to control invasive species or the spread of them, it will be to control disturbance, really, as much as we can. And invasives are good model systems for other species. We can learn a lot about all the research that we've done already, and that can help us predict what's going to happen with the native species. I don't think all native species will be able to adapt to climate change, but at least some of them, we can infer quite clearly that they will actually be able to reasonably migrate and adapt to the new conditions if they're not too fast. And that's all for today. Thank you. I'm not sure what time is it.